It's time to build Kestis' lightsaber from Jedi Survivor. I decided to use this build as an opportunity to try a few new things, so stick around to see how it all turns out. For this project, I'm going to be using the Kestis Survivor hilt made by Corbanth. To go inside the hilt and hold all the electronics is going to be my newly designed chassis. This took me forever since it's the first time I ever tried adding details and using rub and buff. Now we have a tactile button and a NeoPixel connector to start off the electronics. To make the chassis removable, we have a rotary chassis PCB. For sound, we have a 24mm bass speaker, and for the extra features, we have an OLED display, Bluetooth, male micro USB port to connect to our CFX soundboard. For power, we have an 18650 battery, battery tabs, and power switch. And lastly, the newest feature I've never tried before, USB-C with data transfer and charging. There might be one extra thing I want to try along the way, but we'll see what happens. So the first thing on the agenda is to take this lightsaber apart. Corbanth's Kestis Survivor hilt has a lot more parts than any of the other Cal Kestis lightsaber replicas I've worked on. I can't exactly say if that makes it better or worse, but I can say that the sheer amount of screws you have to take out in order to take apart the lightsaber can really get annoying if you have to do it a lot. Luckily, once the hilt is completely installed, we never have to take it apart again, assuming we did everything correctly. Now this section here is meant to be where the speaker sits and where the sound escapes. Having the speaker sit in the middle of the hilt and directly underneath the button is what made this chassis design both unique and pretty annoying. I figured out what I think is a pretty good way to manage this, but you'll have to see my solution later once we get to that part of the build. Now what I like a lot about this hilt is that with the way the button and neck section is made, it's really easy to make this a two-part chassis. What I mean by that is that we're able to install the entire top portion of this hilt, the emitter and button section, separate from the rest of the electronics. That allows for us to have a really nice removable chassis, and to be able to take advantage of the chassis detection feature I like to set up. The last thing I want to mention before getting started on the install is that having the ability to take apart the hilt in as many pieces as this can means that it should be much easier to weather and detail each individual section if you wanted to. I'm not sure I'll be taking much advantage of that though. Looks like this is about as much as I need to take apart, so let's put this copper ring back and get started with the install. This here is a NeoPixel connector holder. I designed this to go into the lightsaber's emitter and hold the connector in place. So why don't we start this build by setting up that connector? The first thing I like to do is put in all the spring-loaded pins. After that, I solder them in place, and then finally attach all the wires I'm going to use. Once that's all done, I like to twist the wires together. This is so that it's easier to route them through small spaces, like the NeoPixel connector holder I showed you earlier. If the connector doesn't quite fit, you'll want to sand down the edges a bit. It should be pretty self-explanatory, but you'll know you've sanded enough once it fits like it should. Next up, we're going to add some E6000. You're going to want to put some on the connector to secure it to the holder, and some on the bottom of the holder to secure it to the bottom of the emitter. Now we can move on to the button. Buttons are always super straightforward. All you have to do is solder on 2 wires and you're done. Now I'm just going to glue this thing to the holder I made for it, and then use some E6000 again to secure this whole thing to the neck. Now let's reassemble more of the hilt so that we can finish off the button section. And there we go. Now the only thing left for this part of the build is to connect everything we just set up to the rotary chassis PCB. Just like with the NeoPixel connector I did earlier, you're going to want to start by setting up the pins and soldering them in place. I didn't mention this last time, but to make it easier to attach the wires, you're going to want to add solder to the pads beforehand. Now that we have the PCB prepped, let's get it connected to everything else. Oh, and I already made sure to put the PCB holder on first. It's at the bottom of the neck. You wouldn't believe how many times I've forgotten that. The rotary chassis PCB is now all wired up and secured in its holder. The only thing left is to use some E6000 to hold the whole thing to the bottom of the neck section. And with that, we just have to wait for the glue to cure. Alright, some time has passed. Let's see if it's all good to go. Looks like the PCB we just set up is holding together well. And the button seems to be working too. With this part of the build complete, we can finally put the hilt back together. Okay, with all the screws tightened and everything back together, this hilt has now been reassembled. So it's finally time to get started on the main chassis. And that brings us to this new part and extra feature I want to show you. So this cool little thing here is called a pixel ring. It's made by Stock Custom Works and is basically a bunch of super tiny pixel accents connected in a circle with easy pads to solder to at the bottom. My plan is to set it up directly underneath the rotary chassis PCB. It's hard to explain what I'm hoping this is going to do, so you're just going to have to wait and see how it turns out. But anyways, let's start setting up the rotary chassis PCB. This is going to require all the same wires of the previous PCB, but in order to support the pixel ring, we're going to have to set up an additional positive and negative. I will add that for the blade, instead of using a single 22 gauge negative wire, I'm going to be using two 24 gauge negative wires. That just makes it easier to solder to the soundboard at the end. And here is where I made a mistake. As I was setting up the positive and negative for the pixel ring, as you can clearly see here, I soldered them to the wrong pads. I only noticed my mistake once the whole build was completed, and so the pixel ring ended up getting a bit fried, and I had to replace it. So yeah, learn from my mistakes, and pay attention to where you're putting your wires. Now let's move on to setting up the speaker. We're going to be using this 24mm speaker because unfortunately 28 doesn't fit. So the speaker is one of the easiest parts of most installs, since it only has two wires and it doesn't matter which one is positive or negative. This is because the speaker pads on the soundboard also don't have a dedicated positive or negative. You're just going to want to make sure not to connect the two lines together. Now since there's no sound venting in the pommel, I had to put the speaker at the top of the chassis. This is because the hilt's sound vents are in the windowed area above the handle. These vents are also why I set up the pixel accent ring. We'll see how it ends up looking, but for now, we can work our way further down the chassis, which brings us to the battery tabs. One will get a red wire, since it'll be the positive side, and the negative will be black. But I'm also adding an additional negative wire, which will be used to set up the USB-C charging. And with the tabs both glued in place, the battery compartment is all set, which means that this build is now starting to pick up the pace. We should only have a handful of parts left, so let's get right to installing the power switch, USB-C port, and USB-C charging module. I'll start by setting up the power switch. So there's not really anything new happening here. One wire goes directly to the soundboard, and the other goes to the positive wires of all the other parts. Now here is where we start getting into new territory. I've never installed a USB-C port in any of my builds before, let alone USB-C charging, so this is all a first for me. It seems pretty straightforward based on the diagrams I've looked at, but there's still a lot of wires going on. Now in order for USB-C charging to be possible, we have to connect it to the battery using a separate charging module. And since I have no idea if these things are going to work at all, I'm not going to glue them into the chassis quite yet, just in case I have to go back and fix something. For now, let's move on to the OLED display and Bluetooth module. Like I always mention, be sure to pre-solder the pads you want to attach your wires to. By adding solder to both the pads and the wires beforehand, it will make the process much easier and allow the solder to flow smoother. That's the OLED done, let's bring in the Bluetooth module. Some Bluetooth modules come with a helper board like this one, but others will just be the Bluetooth. While the helper board is easier to install, keep in mind that it does take up more space. Now let's finish the USB-C setup by installing this male side micro USB. Basically, this is what connects the USB-C to the soundboard. Remember the wires we attached to the USB-C port earlier? We just have to take the wires from that and attach them to this. And once we plug this into the soundboard, we'll be able to use the USB-C to edit the lightsaber directly from the computer. So with that, we have finally gotten to the soundboard. I'll be back once I set this up off camera. I am now back and the soundboard is installed. Normally this means the build is complete, but we aren't quite done yet. As you may remember, there are still a couple parts I haven't glued to the chassis yet, the USB-C port and the charging module. When I was off camera setting up the soundboard, I made sure that they worked first so we can glue them in now, although I'm still going to test it again just to make sure. I'll show you the data transfer later, but for now let's check out the charging. You see that red light that just turned on? That's how we know it works. So with that, I can now say the install is finally completed. With all the new things I wanted to try, like improving my chassis design and adding USB-C features, this took me a lot longer than usual. But all that effort means we should have a really cool lightsaber on our hands. So let's go ahead and turn this thing on. Hopefully nothing starts smoking or explodes. And yes, that has happened to me before. Alright, it's looking pretty good. And check that out, the pixel ring is pretty darn bright. Keep in mind this is after I fixed the mistake I made with the pixel ring from way earlier, so this is really pixel ring number 2. But now that it looks like nothing else is going to go up in smoke on me, I think it's safe to turn this on for real and give this thing a proper test. Alright, force activation is looking good. Now let's make sure swing detection and clash detection is working okay. So far, this is all working exactly how it should be. Now let's test the Bluetooth. We're gonna try some clashes first. And now for blade lockup and blaster effects. And finally, let's cycle through the sound fonts and check out the different colors of the pixel ring. And there we have it. I think I can safely say that we can move on to the final stages of testing. Perfect. Looks like the chassis detection is working. And check this out. This is the pixel accent ring shining through the sound venting. I honestly had no idea how this was going to turn out, but I think it looks pretty good. And there we go. The button and NeoPixel connector are working exactly how I needed them to. I am loving this lightsaber. And now it's time for the moment we've all been waiting for. Let's remove this blade plug and throw in a blade.
This resistance.
I can now say that we have a fully functional Jedi Survivor lightsaber. Now that the install for this lightsaber is completed, let me show you how the USB-C data transfer works. So with the way I set this up, you have to have the chassis inside the hilt when you plug it in. This is so that you can use the button to scroll through the menu until you get to the SD card and USB access.
Audio player. SD card USB access.
Hold down the button to select it, and then in a couple seconds, the SD card contents will pop up on your computer. This makes editing a lot easier since you don't have to take out the SD card every time. And then once you're done editing, you can just eject it from your computer and then unplug it from the chassis. If there's one thing I would do better for the next build that I put a USB-C port in, I would probably want to add a button to the chassis itself. That way you can still use the USB-C to edit the lightsaber even when the chassis is outside the hilt. Now, you might have thought this would have been the end of the video since we finished installing the lightsaber, but nope, we're not quite finished yet. You see, the handle of this hilt is way too light. In the game, the grip section is darker and more worn down from use in battles. So today my goal is to do something similar through the use of chemical weathering. Let's start by taking apart the hilt and isolating the grip section. And there we go, we're almost ready to begin weathering. Of course, I'll first want to make sure to protect the silver ring at the top. Now it's all covered up. So to darken the metal, I'll be using something called aluminum black. In order for it to work best, I'll have to first use this Scotch-Brite pad to roughen up the surface of the handle. As you can see, it's much brighter than before. That means we're now ready to apply some aluminum black. I found that the best way to apply it was to pour some on a paper towel first, and then rub it into the metal that way. And keep in mind that the more you put on and the longer it sits, the darker it will get. So once the surface looks dark enough for you, rinse it off using some water and some more towels. After maybe 2 rounds of aluminum black, look how much darker it is already. You know what? I think that might actually be enough for me. Let's put this thing back together and see how it looks.
This resistance.
Wow, this looks fantastic. I can't believe how much better it looks just with a darker grip. This lighting does make it look a little more black than it really is though. I think I could probably beat it up a little bit more, but for now, I think I'll leave it as it is. That's because there's one last upgrade I want to do to the hilt, adding wires to the emitter boxes. In between the shrouds of a Cal Kestis lightsaber, there's a rectangular accent piece just like this. There's 2 of these in total, one on the front and one on the back. And while these are exactly the same as the in-game model, they are missing a couple key details. If you look closely once the boxes are removed, you'll see 4 holes with 2 skinny lines running between them. This is where this red and blue wire come in. As you can see, those lines fit these wires perfectly. By adding these wire accents, I can make my lightsaber even closer to what it looks like in the game. Now I just have to cut the wires and glue them in place. Here's what one looks like fully completed. Now I have to do the other one, and then I can add them to the hilt. And there we have it. Both pieces are now fully completed and back on the hilt. I decided to have the front be blue and red, and the back be red and blue. But now, I have finally completed my Jedi Survivor lightsaber. The emitter box details were the final piece to bring this whole project to a close. So I want to thank everyone who took the time to watch this video. It means a lot to me, and I'm very proud of how this build turned out. If you want to see more builds like this, feel free to subscribe.